Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Aisha binti Akbar Ali. My matric number is 23 DBT 19F2018.
My name is Saranya. I'm from DBT 4B. My matric card number is 23 DBT 19F2021.
Good afternoon. My name is Teng Jia Yi. My matric number is F2002.
My name is Siti Fatimah Azzahrah binti Muhammad Yusuf and my matric number is 23 DBT 19F2004. Today we are going to present about the rules and regulation of genetically modified organism. Before we talk about the rules and regulation of genetically modified organism, first of all, we need to know more about what is genetically modified organism. According to the World Health Organization, it can be defined as organisms such as plant, animal, and microorganisms in which the genetic material, their DNA, has been altered in the way that does not occur naturally by mating or the natural recombination. The technology is often called as modern biotechnology or gene technology. Sometimes it's also known as a recombinant DNA technology or genetic engineering. It allows selected individual genes to be transferred from one organism to another, also between non-related species. Food produced from or using genetically modified organisms are often known as genetically modified food. Some regulatory systems reflect policies that are more permissive toward genetically engineered crops and food, and others reflect policies that are more precautionary. A number of countries have adopted a process-based approach to the regulation in which food and crops that have been modified through a specific set of genetic engineering techniques are subject to the pre-market regulatory safety review for food and safety and environmental protection. To considerable extent, international trade and other agreements constrain the domestic product regulation policies of countries that are parties to the agreement. There is a safety assessment of genetically engineered food, and this is established in the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. There is a risk assessment and risk management, and the risk assessment is including 4 steps. There is hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. Thirdly is the environmental risk assessment of the genetically engineered crops, and the assessment is the precautionary principle. Precaution involves in taking measures to avoid uncertain future risks. This principle is a policy approach related to the regulation of risks to health and safety and the environment. Lastly is the socio-economic consideration. The example of regulation regarding the socio-economic issues is not a science basis, is mandatory labeling the genetically engineered food. Mandatory labeling of genetically engineered that provide information that enable consumer autonomy and choice, that rationally avoid the needs of scientific substantiation that claim genetically engineered food need to be labeled because they are less safe than the non-genetically engineered food.
For this part, I'm going to talk about the discussion where we discuss about the rules and regulation, the importance of rules and regulatory for the genetic modified organisms. In this case, we're going to talk about each country's rules and regulatories. Different nations have different rules and regulatory in the genetically modified organism field. First, definitions of the kind of crops and food that are subject to regulation vary from the country to country, which is different countries has different standards about their genetic modified organisms and how do they define what type of organisms are genetically modified. For example, a product's regulation depends on the use of the defined genetic engineering process. In some other countries, products are regulated on the basis of the risks posed by a product, intended use or characteristics, such as whether you can use the genetic modified organism to plant a lot of illegal plants, or some products that will cause some environmental issues to the country. Next, I'm going to talk about the gonna talk about the other one. The next one will be that some country depends on the use of the genetic engineered product, such as just now I mentioned. What do they use it for? If they are doing illegal things or not, and the risk of the product, whether does it risk in environmentally or pose a risk to the consumers who uses or buys the genetically modified organisms or foods. So next is the biosafety considerations, whether these genetic modified foods will cause issues to the health of the consumers or even the health of the environment of the country. Next will be the socio-economic concerns for the country, which is like whether does it affect the economy of the country, does it make it better or does it make it worse. So next is the last one will be the regulatory streams differ in how they allocate decisions between scientists and politicians. For example, some countries focuses more on the scientist decision whether these genetic modified organisms or food are suitable for the consumers of the country or not, or some countries who listens to the president on the decision whether to import this kind of genetic modified organisms or food. That's all. Thank you very much.
The conclusion of GMO rules and regulation: genetically engineered crops can reduce some environmental risks associated with conventional agriculture, but will also introduce new challenges that must be addressed. Society will always have to decide when and where genetic engineering is safe enough. That's all. Thank you.
I will be presenting about the suggestions for improvements. So the first point is subjected to safety testing. So new varieties, whether genetically engineered or conventionally bred, must be subjected to safety testing if they have novel characteristics with potential hazards. So the second point is should be addressed by policymakers, the private sector and the public. Issues regarding product safety, socio-economic issues, as well as technology governance issues should be addressed in a way that considers competing interests of various stakeholders and inherent trade-offs. So the next point is regulation should be developed that uses strict novelty, potential hazard, and exposure as criteria. A tiered approach to regulation should be developed, such as the omics technology, which compares the molecular profile of a new variety and a counterpart already in widespread use. So the next point is regulating authorities should be particularly proactive in communicating information to the public. So they should be also proactive in seeking input from the public about how emerging genetic engineering technologies such as the genome editing and synthetic biologies, or how their products might be regulated, and about how new regulatory methodologies such as the use of omic technologies might be used. So the next point is regulating authorities should bear in mind the importance of transparency, access to information, and public participation. Information such as confidential business information or other legal grounds must not be excluded from the public disclosure, as this would ensure that exemptions are as narrow as possible. So the next point is regulatory agency responsible for environmental risks should have the authority to impose continuing requirements. They should also require environmental monitoring for unexpected effects after a genetically engineered crop has been approved for commercial release. And the final point is regulators should focus on the extent to which the novel characteristics of plant variety. Plant variety should be tested whether they are likely to impose a risk to human health or the environment, the extent of uncertainty regarding the severity of potential harm, and the potential for exposure. So in the next slide, there is a diagram of the omic technologies. So in this technology, current varieties will be compared with the new varieties for differences. So if there are no differences or the differences has no expected health or environmental effects, no further testing is required. However, if the differences has potential health or environmental effects or the differences cannot be interpreted, further testing is required before the product is released to the public. So that's all from me. Thank you.